previous presentation, I suggested a number of reasons why Christianity or Christians, their churches, may and should address political concerns, engage politics. First, I have suggested that nothing in the Constitution prohibits such engagement. Secondly, an authentic understanding of the Christian message recognizes that it addresses social, economic, and political concerns, and not only personal ones. Third, all ideologies, whether religious, Christian, or so-called secular ones, can be used to promote violence, and all should be wary of that use. Finally, bringing Christian reasoning into public space in a pluralistic democratic society does not have to be a conversation stopper, so long as we all recognize religious voices as simply one voice among many in the varied topography of a pluralistic public society. I have made several essays available to you that talk in a broad and general sort of way about how the church may and should engage politics. One I want you to pay particular attention to is an essay by Robert Binney called "The Church and Politics: Four Possible Connections." I want to outline for you here in a general sort of way the four possible connections that Binney sees between the church and politics, and his appraisal of each of those ways of connecting. The first way that the church, as an institution, as a denomination, might engage public policy is through what Binney calls an ethic of character, an ethics of character. He says that such an approach is both indirect and unintentional. By indirect, he means the church as an institution makes no attempt to influence public policy. It does so only through its individual members, or what are called the laity. It is unintentional in the sense that the church has no particular public policy agenda. Rather, it instills in its members certain fundamental moral commitments. But as a church, it does not apply those moral commitments directly or intentionally to public issues. Now, a part of what's behind Binney's account of this approach is a recognition that churches inevitably shape the moral beliefs and commitments of their members. Christianity and the Bible presents a profound understanding of human nature and human destiny, of God's will for human beings, and God's will with respect to our destiny as human beings. And all of that has profound moral implications, implications in terms of human behavior and human character that church members will absorb as they live under the message and the discipline of a particular denomination. Interestingly, Binney says forthrightly that this is arguably the most important, fundamental, and potentially effective way the church influences the public order. What he's suggesting is that the most effective and significant way that churches affect the broader society is through the character, through the choices of their individual members, shaped week to week in the gathering of the congregation. Now, while that ethic of character may be the most effective way, in Binney's opinion, that churches impact public life, many in the church don't find that completely unintentional approach adequate or adequately reflective of the church's mission and ministry in the world. So some churches move beyond that ethic of character into what Benny calls an ethics of conscience. Now, in this approach, the church's impact is still indirect, in the sense that the church, as a denomination, as an institution, doesn't try to affect public policy. It does that only through its members. But it's a bit more intentional than the previous model in shaping the members' moral commitments in their relationship to particular public policy issues. He says it this way: the church in this mode directs its moral vision self-consciously to specific issues in the public sphere. It aims to form the conscience of its own people regarding the public issues by bringing its religious and moral traditions to bear on those specific items. So what he has in mind is that a church might take its broad general moral commitments. We're going to talk about love and justice, and then lead its people in thinking about what those broad general moral commitments derived from the gospel, from the Bible, might mean in terms of particular political issues like abortion or capital punishment or economic policies related to poverty. Benny's example of this sort of approach is interesting. He speaks of his own personal involvement with something called Illinois Impact, which was a program of the Illinois Council of Churches. And what Benny says is that Illinois Impact would pick 6 issues every year. Pick those issues presumably based upon a sense of the church's own or Christianity's own moral priorities, but also in terms of issues that it thought it could make a difference on by bringing church people to bear on those issues. Now, what I find incredibly interesting, what you should notice about what Benny says about this, Illinois Impact did not tell the members of their churches how they should vote or what they should advocate in relation to each of those issues they picked. Rather, they laid out the problems, the possibilities, the dilemmas related to those particular issues, alerted their members as to when votes would be taken, but then left it to individual Christians to decide for themselves based on this basically educational program of Illinois Impact, left it to those individual members to decide how they would, or what policies they would advocate. Benny likes this kind of approach. He likes it because it acknowledges the diversity of opinion within congregations, and yet shapes that diversity of opinion from the perspective of the gospel. And he wishes, as says specifically, that he wishes there was more of this in Christian denominations in the United States. Now, as we move into the third and fourth categories of political engagement that Benny identifies, we're moving into categories in which the church's engagement as an institution, as a denomination, now becomes much more direct. It does not depend entirely upon its individual members bringing Christian influence to bear on public life. The church as a body attempts to do that. So it's direct. The church becomes, he says, a public actor in and of itself. And it's intentional in that it intends to shape public policy in certain particular directions. Benny's example of this kind of approach points to certain pastoral letters that were published by the bishops of the Catholic Church in the United States in the 1980s. They developed documents called The Challenge of Peace, which analyzed the nuclear arms race and advocated for a reduction and even an elimination of nuclear weaponry. And also a document called Economic Justice for All, in which they analyzed the U.S. economic system and the global economic system and advocated for specific governmental policies that would more effectively address poverty. Now, Benny is a bit wary of this direct sort of approach. But he says if it's done fairly and infrequently, it is an appropriate form of Christian and the church's engagement with politics. With regard to frequency, he says, look, the church should only address issues about which it has something distinctive to say. Now, he affirms the Roman Catholic bishops' documents on the economy and on nuclear arms. He doesn't say exactly what it was about those documents that reflected a distinctive Christian voice on those matters. But let me suggest something here. I think his criteria of having a distinctive Christian contribution to make to the discussion of an issue would apply, let's say, to capital punishment. The typical arguments about capital punishment focus on whether execution is a just punishment for some particular heinous crime, and whether or not a policy of capital punishment or executions for such crimes actually deters them. Now, with regard to that latter, deterrence, probably the church has no particular insight or expertise out of its theological tradition to have anything new to say or different from what anybody else might say about the sociological and historical and statistical evidence as to whether execution deters. But it might have something to say about the issue of justice. Because at the heart of the Christian message, the central Christian symbol, is itself an execution, the cross of Jesus Christ. And a distinctive dimension of the Christian message is God's love, grace, and forgiveness that transcends any strict concern about just punishment. Also, the Christian message affirms the power of God to transform even the most heinous criminal or the most vile sinner, turning that person more toward the image of Christ. So those themes within the Christian message might give a church something distinctive to say about capital punishment. Another point that Benny makes is that any document of this sort or any expression of this sort by the church should be based on serious preparation. He says church leaders, before they promote any particular political agenda in a document like this, should seriously do their homework, study all of that evidence with reference to which they have no particular expertise, but study it carefully to be sure they understand the dilemmas and the disagreements that lie behind such issues. Finally, he says it's important that they distinguish what he calls levels of authority. And what he means by this is surely the church has the authority, or church leaders have the authority to proclaim the non-negotiable Christian commitment, let's say, to love and justice. But as they move toward applying those non-negotiable principles, non-negotiable from a Christian perspective, to specific issues, the judgments they make have a lesser authority than do their claims related to those more general principles. He uses the language of straight line thinking. He says the church should always avoid, and Christians should always avoid, straight line thinking, believing that they can somehow move from their general, broad, non-negotiable commitments in a straight line, in a direct line to obvious public policy pronouncements and commitments. One more word about Benny's idea of the church as a social conscience. He mentions in this context a phrase used by an earlier 20th century American theologian, Richard Niebuhr, called social pioneering, in which the church affects the broader public by identifying some need or some issue and then embodying through its own life a response to that issue, which it hopes and which the broader society often does recognize and turn to itself eventually. Benny cites the example of hospitals, orphanages, universities, and even kindergartens as institutions or arrangements that originally were created by the church in response to what it perceived as a social need. And then, of course, over time, non-religious actors, governmental actors, took on the responsibility for meeting those social needs in ways that the church pioneered. Benny argues that that Niebuhr thought this was the most effective and persuasive approach to direct intentional influence. I questioned that a bit because it strikes me that social pioneering, as important as it is, and as historically significant as it is, remains a sort of an indirect approach to politics. It doesn't directly attempt to change the policies and practices of the wider society. It does that indirectly, now not through its individual members necessarily, but for the arrangements that Christians on their own create in response to some social need. Well, whether it belongs in this category or not, where Benny puts it, certainly you should be aware of social pioneering as one way in which the church has and may continue to have influence in the broader public. Now, a final form of church engagement with politics, Benny calls the church with power. Like the previous category, this is direct. It is a way in which the church or denomination itself tries to impact public life. It's intentional in that it brings a political agenda to bear on public life. The difference is that here the church moves from merely trying to influence the government or influence public actors and moves into actually employing power to change public life, to change what government policy and practice is. Here's the way Benny describes it. It no longer relies on the persuasiveness of argument or example. It commits its funds, political weight, and people power to pressure relevant decision makers to move toward a specific policy objective. Now, it is interesting here that among the examples that Benny cites, and the only one I think that's directly relevant to the American context, is the example of denominational advocacy offices in Washington, D.C. and at various state capitals. Those advocacy offices, which are arms of Christian denominations, locate themselves near the centers of governmental power and then try to apply church positions to political issues and thereby influence or shape law and public policy. Now, Benny believes the church employing power rather than persuasion is something that should be avoided at all costs. He worries that when the church employs its power to affect public policy, it turns the church into a partisan society that infuriates people who have a different perspective on debatable public policy issues. I mean, what he primarily has in mind here is the degree to which that kind of work divides the church. The church, through voting or through its leadership, decides to take a particular position, and then use power to shape government in pursuit of that position. But what about all those church members who disagree, who've come to a different conclusion? It divides the church. He also says it confuses the functions of church and state. Secular authorities and agencies are the appropriate wielders of power in society, he says. Churches are quintessentially themselves when they rely on the power of the word, not worldly might. So he seems to be saying, look, we have a right to say anything. We have a right to advocate for anything if our manner of doing that is simply persuasive, to appeal to people's reason. But when we begin to exert power, we now have moved over into a realm that is outside the church's proper function. And I think here he makes an argument that's similar to the one we associated with the Mennonites and Amish earlier, and that is a concern that when you move into politics as power, beyond simply trying to influence political life, but to exert power in political life, you somehow undermine the church's more proper mission and ministry. Here's the way he says it. It threatens to instrumentalize and secularize the sacred symbols of the church. The church loses its needed distance from all political action. Its claim to point to transcendence collapses if it draws too close to a political program of action. Consequently, it has a more difficult time proclaiming a universal gospel to all sinners, regardless of the political fence they are on. And again, you see here clearly a concern about how advocacy using power in particular divides church members one from another. If the church takes a particular position, that's bound to cause division and infuriate those who disagree. But it also then inhibits, in Benny's view, the church's ability to proclaim a message of grace and forgiveness and transformation that is relevant and applies and should be received by all people. Now, he does say there are occasions when the issues are so pronounced and what's right or wrong from a Christian perspective is so clear that it's appropriate to move into this form of engagement. And he identifies the civil rights movement, where the churches were very involved in an attempt to overturn segregation in the United States. He cites that as an important use and a right use of this kind of engagement with politics. It does seem to me that Benny is a bit unclear here about the distinction between the third category and the fourth. I mean, when does persuasion become power? And particularly as he labels the advocacy offices that denominations have as exerting power rather than merely being persuasive. I mean, why is an advocacy office taking positions different from a bishop's pastoral letter, which he affirms, which does the same thing? And couldn't those working in church advocacy offices say, all we're doing is offering, with all of its persuasive power, a Christian perspective to the legislators, to the government, on issues about which the church has expressed itself. Hopefully, this has helped. This has been useful to you, as you think about both earlier the appropriateness of Christian engagement with politics, and expanding your sense of the various ways in which that might be done.